My name is Michael Dunbar. I'm one of the technical managers at Killgerm. My day-to-day job is mostly delivering training courses, and I get involved in some of the field biologist inspections up and down the country, sort of supporting our customers. I'm very excited to talk about this particular topic, something particularly close to my heart, because I've spent quite a lot of my pest control career in what we would class these sort of complex sites. And yeah, hopefully there'll be a little bit of a refresher for those more experienced amongst us. And hopefully there'll be something for everyone in the talk. What do we mean by this sort of concept of complex sites? Well, like I said, complex sites will mean different things to different people. And hopefully as I go through the tour, little light bulbs will start lighting up in people's minds, thinking, "Oh, actually, this could be relevant to one of the sites I'm dealing with at the moment." But this is an example that I sort of will be talking about, these sort of massive behemoths of sites, whether it be complexity and challenges with regards to the site's size and the sheer amounts of legwork and labor intensity that those sites present. But whether it be a food manufacturing site with a very high sort of compartmentalization and those different processes and simultaneously across the site with different levels of pest risk in each one of those. And unfortunately, as we talk about, the size of the sites, as the sites increase in size, unfortunately, the size of the pests does not. So it's a lot of the time we find ourselves in this humongous site looking for essentially a needle in a haystack. And it's an important point to raise early on that, small actions have a big impact in what we do. Thinking of integrated pest management and how we approach our usual pest control work can definitely be reflected in these sort of sites. So let's dig a bit deeper into that whole concept. So we do face fairly similar challenges as we would across any other site. So we've got potential ingress of rodent pests from the outside, exploiting proofing defects, or a site could have a potentially very poor closed door policy in place, something that's not being enforced. It's not an uncommon thing when you pull up to a site and you ring the buzzer to be let through the gate, and all of a sudden all the shutters start going down on the side of the warehouse. Well, all of a sudden they've remembered to close the shutters down. And another important thing to mention is obviously the import of mice. We can see it through the data of the spread. For example, the West Midlands behavioural resistant strain of mice that essentially followed the motorway corridors up and down the country. And now it's a very commonly found strain pretty much in every major city. So back in the day, we used to have the spread of rats around the world through the ships. Nowadays, we've got a spread of rodents through the lorries up and down our motorways. So what sort of things do we look for? It's like any other site, right? So I did say it's going to be going back to basics a little bit, but we're looking for those specific signs of rodent activity on site. The most obvious one, as we know, is seeing live or dead rodents. That means you don't have to put your detective hat on and look for all these tiny little clues. We can physically see what's on site and what it is that we're dealing with. And that takes that element of mystery out of it, I guess, in a way. Certain sites, obviously, the activity is ongoing and quite persistent. Will have quite a distinct rodent smell, potentially scratching noises. If you've got a big object with a sort of annex of offices, certain office workers in that area might hear scratching in the ceiling or in the subfloor void and wall cavities, etc. Footprint and tail swags. Again, in these sorts of environments, it's very difficult to include all areas of the site in a scheduled cleaning. So there'll be bits somewhere in secluded corners at high levels in the cable trays that are not cleaned very frequently. And those are the areas that rodents would like to use to sort of bypass a monitoring sometimes and to effectively move around the site frequently. Additionally, clean tracks, if we've got different bits of gaps around brickwork and potentially some old bit of smearing. If it's covered in cobwebs, we know that's potentially not something that's being frequently or actively used by that particular rodent population right now. If you've got a lovely compacted bit of soil underneath and clear of cobwebs, then it's starting to light some warning lights for us, doesn't it? Additionally, during our external inspections, finding the burrows, identifying those burrows, nesting areas, nesting materials inside of the site. Not always will you find an active live nest. Sometimes you'll find remnants of the nesting material up and down. I mentioned smear marks already, physical damage, and those droppings of rodents all around the site. And again, it's a nice slide to put on the PowerPoint presentation and say, yeah, this is it. But when you've got a 1.5 mile long warehouse with 200 loading bays, it can prove a bit of a challenge, for sure. So as anything, it boils down to the good old integrated pest management. And it's a complex idea to explain in one sentence, I guess. And we should all be very familiar with integrated pest management. And a couple of things from integrated pest management that are particularly crucial that could sometimes be overlooked in our day-to-day work. We all know that we have to use a variety of approaches when dealing with any pest species as much as we can. With the best intentions, sometimes that might not be possible. But, using a variety of chemical or physical control methods, keeping accurate records of what has been used on site to give us an indication of where the activity hotspots are that will allow us to produce effective heat maps of the site when it comes to that point, if we're doing sort of escalation visits at that point. And obviously, going back to the crew, risk hierarchy, proofing, housekeeping, stacking, all those bits, environmental management externally, cutting back vegetation. We know that rodents do not like to be out in the open. So ensuring that we have a lot of open spaces around our sites can be, again, quite beneficial. Customer training and awareness is the point that I was going back to that sometimes gets overlooked. The people that in these objects, you have very strict, people have very specific roles within those businesses and within those sites. And the people that you give your reports to might not always find themselves in every nook and cranny of that particular site. It's the forklift truck drivers, it's the cleaners that will be your eyes and ears. So ensuring that the sort of pest awareness training is completed on site, that the staff know what to look for, and more importantly, that there is a very strong reporting system for them to reenact, essentially. So when they spot some sort of activity, they spot whatever evidence it is, they either have a pest sightings log or they have a dedicated person that they can report those findings to ensure that they get back to you as a call out or when you come for your next routine visit inspection. Because unfortunately, in a lot of the sites that we're going to be talking about, and those complex sites, this is the life that the rodents lead, right? They have an abundance of everything they could possibly need. They've got places to hide. They've got areas where they feel very, very safe, almost untouchable. They've got an abundance of food. They can get the water from condensation inside of the wall cavities and the pipes, from the air conditioning unit frosting. So our job is to essentially make their life as difficult and as inhospitable as we potentially can. So turn the mornings from this to look a little bit more like this, make it a little bit more grumpy in the morning, make them desperate enough to have, a look in that whatever control or monitoring measure that we've put down to look for them. Like I said earlier, it's important. You have to identify those risks to be able to mitigate them. So in terms of gathering the information, it goes back to a colleague of ours. Many of you might be familiar with Mr. Melvin Knapp. He's very, very proper, and he refers to what we do on our day-to-day as Fieldcraft. And I really like that phrase. Fieldcraft is the quality of our inspections. That essentially is what pest control boils down to. If we don't identify all of the risks, there's no way we could possibly mitigate them. So having a solid sort of quality of inspection, shall we say, that Fieldcraft, and getting ahead of the root cause, being proactive rather than reactive, is key here. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the sort of environments that we could be facing and coming across around these sorts of objects. And with the use of, I say, modern technology, I think everybody's very, very familiar with, we've just had talks about AI. That's, using Google Earth is hardly modern technology compared to that. But we all have access on our smartphones to Google Earth or Google Maps or whatever mapping system that you are using. And we're able to see these satellite images of the sites that we're going to go to or going to attempt to treat. And I certainly still do this if I've got a new inspection, new site I'm going to go to. Before I go to site, I just have a quick scan on Google Maps and see what it is. And a lot of the time, it'd be interesting what you're able to find. So obviously, this particular object is a supermarket distribution center that I've spent quite a bit of time in. And obviously, as we can see, there's a dual carriageway running just On the other side of this sort of vegetation, it's very steep banking from the warehouse wall itself down to that dual carriageway. We can see parked trailers and porter cabins along the edge of the side here. The lorries that are doing the deliveries and taking stock out of the site up there. And this is an interesting bit. A lot of the supermarkets and these complex sites will have environments that, this site is puts a massive, massive footprint, doesn't it, on the good old satellite image. So to kind of counteract the amount of cement that they've poured into this previously heavily vegetated area, they create a little pond and a little sort of oasis for local wildlife that usually attracts this wildlife, but as you know, could potentially pose certain problems. This is an example of a very different site, but again, these sort of risk factors could potentially be very much present. This is what one of my old colleagues described as a Frankenstein site. And it's quite an apt description because it was an old Victorian structure that was initially designed to be a flour mill. And obviously, as the standards of modern food manufacturing have changed, have improved, there have been other bits added to it. So walking through the site, you're going through a brand new bit and going through like a dingy basementy sort of looking place back to a brand new object. So as you add bits onto sites, that create potential risks. We know that during the construction processes, the drainage issues could become evident, potentially allow rodents into sites and into the building fabric. And additionally, looking at that satellite image, we can see that obviously it's surrounded by arable fields. There's a small housing estate there and a little brook running around just past the site. And obviously, because it was an old-fashioned flour mill, that's what was used to power it back in the day. But again, in terms of modern standards, that poses a few risks to us as we try to manage pests. Now, with regards to the environment on site itself, some of those sites will be going to quite frequently. Depends on the service agreement that you have with that site. You might be there every other week. You might be there every week. You might be there once a month. But once you've been to a site a few times, you get familiar with what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And a lot of the time, those sites will undergo renovation, expansion, new parts of the warehouse being expanded or added, new services being provided to their customers, which will expect them to be adjusted in terms of the processes. So those temporary porter cabin and those temporary offices all of a sudden appearing on site are very, very common. Every time you see that sort of situation on your site, don't just walk past it. It is a known vector of rats from site to site. And, these porter cabins are insulated. They're designed for human beings to spend their days within them. So there'll be certain comforts within them that will also be comfortable for rodents. A visual inspection as a minimum, potentially putting some sort of monitoring into those objects, because once they're near that site, once those rodents get established and comfortable within that structure, potentially undergo a breeding cycle. That's when they start spilling out, start exploring, start poking around the warehouse walls and seeing the ways that they could potentially exploit those gaps and get into that oasis, as I said, of that nirvana, shall we say, of abundance of food or resources. Well, as I mentioned before, we know that rodents don't like to be out in the open. So, these are the sort of recommendations that you should be raising every time you go into a site and you see that the neighbouring site is in that sort of state. That puts your site at risk. Whether it's be reaching out to the neighbouring property and trying to do something about it, that's up to the site to manage. But it's something that we should be highlighting to the customer as a potential risk factor. Now, this picture irks me in many ways, as it probably will do many of you listening in. I mean, where do we begin? Plastic's a lovely insulator, right? It's nice and soft. I'd be surprised if there wasn't anything living in this little pile here. So the sort of conversations you should be having with the site at this point to try and mitigate that risk of rodents, they're almost inviting trouble by storing this sort of waste right against the warehouse wall. Not only that, right against the roller shutter doors, which are, in my opinion, one of the most vulnerable parts of any warehouse. No matter how new, no matter how modern, if you're standing inside and the shutters are closed, there will be some daylight coming through those gaps at the bottom. So ideally, what should happen is that the processes on site should be set up in such a way as to prevent the buildup of waste. What makes it more frustrating is all those cages that are parked up all against that wall here that are completely empty, and yet this waste is just sitting here. So at the very least, try to get it away from the building. Don't invite the trouble where it's not supposed to be. This is another classic that some of you might relate to as well. We're getting a skip. It's getting delivered tomorrow or next week, and we still haven't seen that skip for a good few weeks. So yeah, having those conversations, highlighting those issues, and more importantly, documenting them in your reports is an important thing, because if things were to be going south, shall we say, and somebody were to be reading your reports, you back yourself up that way, don't you? Perfect. This is another, it's like reliving my worst nightmares here. This is another picture that I've taken on one of the sites I used to look after. This is a site I was doing quarterly field biologist inspections at. This is a spillage of flour, and those pictures are taken 3 months apart from the exact same location. And again, this is the frustrating part of the job. We do all the legwork, we walk around those sites, we pick up on those details, these spillages. It's a massive spillage, and it should have been cleaned up pretty much as it happened. And unfortunately, it hasn't. And God knows what sort of Among Us or sort of fungal spores are sprouting on there, those orange little bits on the side. But just because you do your job doesn't mean that the site is going to pull through. But again, just be patient with those recommendations and keep them in your report as long as that recommendation remains uncompleted, unfinished. In terms of proofing, we know the usual size. We usually aim to proof to a mouse size, shall we say. So anything sort of larger than that 5-6 mil gaps, we're looking to seal off and minimize the risk of that potential rodent pest ingress. Just a few examples from some of the sites. If you see any daylight coming through, if you see any bits of sealant around the edges and perimeters of the walls, these should be sealed up pretty much straight away, potentially creating harborages and egress points for those pests. Never underestimate the size of a hole a rodent can squeeze through as well. Our guide is that 6 millimeter for mice, 15 millimeters for rats. But as the rodents grow and they're still in a juvenile stage, their skeletons are not fully, shall we say, solidified yet. They're mostly cartilaginous. Is that a word? We'll go with it. It's cartilaginous skeletons. They can really squeeze themselves through some really, really impressive holes and gaps. So anything that you see, just have some proofing materials in your tech bag as you're walking around those sites, and it's a lot easier just to get them done with there and then. Because once they do enter your premises, things get a bit more difficult from that point on. This is, again, particularly troublesome sites that I've been dealing with at one point, and you can see this cheeky little fella doing some parkour over our snap traps. So, behavioral resistance is definitely something that we come across in that trap shyness and avoidance of our control measures. But particularly in these sorts of objects, if an infestation has been going on for a few breeding cycles, which we know with rodents, it doesn't take a long time at all. That new generation of rodents doesn't necessarily follow the expected behaviors that we would see in other types of objects. They were born and bred in this particular environment, so they won't necessarily be following the edges of the sides or following closely to the wall line. They will be climbing on the racking, they will be jumping from pallet to pallet, and a lot of the activity will be found at high levels. So we have to account for those changes in behavior, that unusual behavior that rodents present in these sorts of sites. I think another, more of a side note really, but it's an important point to raise that, having that relationship with the site is quite an important thing. When you follow up on your promises to the site, you build that element of trust, you spend that little bit of extra time giving the customer a little bit more value for money, showing off your knowledge, talking about rodents and managing those expectations as well. I know a lot of the time, customers just think we're those wizards of pest control. We've got a pest controller, so they're just going to deal with the problem there and then. Managing those expectations in terms of timeframes of how long certain issues can take to resolve is an important thing. And once you have built that relationship with the site, you all of a sudden gain access to certain difficult parts of the site a lot quicker. Those recommendations will be completed on time. You're not going to have to fight an additional battle on a separate front there. Again, checking stock coming in. So routine stock inspections should be established in this sort of sites. And again, looking at those pictures, it's a lovely point to raise on the PowerPoint. It's a lot more difficult to to sort of action it in real life, if you like. But if we know that potentially we've had a specific piece of stock that has been linked to previous sort of spouts of activity, it would be a good idea to ensure that we monitor any incoming stock from whether that's the manufacturer or transport company in the future, just to ensure that we don't introduce those pests unwillingly into our site. So yeah, stock coming in inspections should be definitely established. And because a lot of those sites will be dealing, with food manufacture and food destined for human consumption, there's that, legal responsibility in terms of traceability. So you can see on this particular diagram, you've got the product and the transportation flow. So it goes down from the field to essentially to our plate. With that communication, the information flow, you can see that it works both ways. So in terms of traceability, you'll be able to know which particular stock, the sites will be able to tell you how long that particular piece of stock has been sitting in the site, what time it got delivered, by what company, where was it before, and all that information is available to you as that company's pest controller. So make sure that you use that information and make sure that, you challenge your site. If there is particular pieces of stock that have been sitting on the shelf, they've over-ordered for Christmas or Easter restocking or whatever it may be, and that piece of stock just hasn't shifted. So those pieces of stock that have been sitting there for a long period of time are the most vulnerable ones. And again, we talked about the abundance of food resources that are available to rodents in these sort of environments. Again, this particular image here is particularly irksome to me. Just eating the meat out of the pork pie and leaving the crust. That's proper psychopath behavior, I think. But it's quite a common behavior in house mice. They tend to hollow out these objects. You see it when house mice are kept sort of in captivity in certain, like petting zoos, or there are certain places that do that. And if a piece of food is thrown in, they tend to hollow it out from the inside and leave that shell, and then they work through the shell itself. Again, on the left here, you've got the sort of the systematic shaving off the layers of chocolate bars. So those two pieces of stock were damaged by mice. This middle one was a lovely Easter egg, lovely decoration left there by a particularly difficult rat to catch in this particular situation. So obviously, focusing on the food sources is definitely one thing, but we shouldn't just fixate on those. We have to remember that if the site does not have, certain environments where the rodents potentially can nest, they will nest within that stock. And again, from my personal experience, they tend to like tea bags quite a lot. I don't know whether they get a bit of a buzz from caffeine or like the flavor of it, but I think it's more to do with the tea bags themselves. The material the tea bags are made out of is quite nice and soft, and it promotes nice and lovely nesting for them. But again, things like sanitary products, toilet rolls, anything soft, anything with a bit of bulk to it and a bit of softness, has a potential to create that nesting environment for those rodents. So don't just fixate on the food sources, although that's what you're trying to protect. But, a damaged stock of toilet roll getting to the customer's house is going to be equally as bad to your customer. Now, a few sort of techniques that we would use in these sorts of objects, and this is when I was looking after these sorts of sites back in the day, we'd spend most of our days corralling stock, really. You get a forklift truck driver assigned to you for the day, and you just go around and cherry pick, whether based on previous experience or potential risk of the stock, or again, you've identified a certain piece of stock that has been on site for a long period of time. You get the forklift driver to get it down for you, and you set up a corral around it to essentially capture and catch anything that could potentially run off that particular pallet as you're decanting it. So the point of the decanting is to ensure that the stock is not infested, that you don't have a nest inside of that particular stock. And again, it's quite a labor-intensive process, particularly if you're shifting, a few pallets of those 20-kilogram sacks of rice or whatever it may be. There will be a few beads of sweat dripping off the tip of your nose at the end of it. But it is an important sort of monitoring tool. Yes. Because they are, as I said, they are happy to live within that stock. And, we will occasionally find those nests within that piece of stock as you do work. So as I said earlier, to me, integrated pest management is all about being proactive rather than being reactive, right? That's the cornerstone of it. And having a solid monitoring setup is key. And again, trying to, work out on how you're going to set it up in a huge, massive site can be quite difficult. But again, it goes back to the point of trying to focus on the basics focus on the weak points of the structure, the weak points of the sides. If we have wall cavities within that structure, see if we can potentially get some inspection hatches put in. If there are any existing inspection hatches, make sure that you monitor them, make sure that you check them regularly. But places like loading bays, right? We've mentioned that they're a very difficult part of the warehouse to protect. So the use of these ultraviolet tracking preparations, in my experience, have been invaluable. A lot of the time, because we have an abundance of food resources, that could be very difficult for the rodents to start taking the bait and feeding from the bait stations that we put down if we go down the rodenticide route. So by monitoring them and trying to establish the numbers and movements across the site, that gives us very valuable data. And again, account for that different behavior. Don't just put tracking gel around the perimeter of the site because that's where rodents like to run. The shelving, the racking in between the pallets, this is where they're going to be feeling safest in these sorts of areas. Expansion joints as well, we're going to get onto those on a separate slide. Do this talk without mentioning the cladding. Most of these sorts of objects are sort of clad with different types of materials. But yes, a lot of the time you'll find that the cladding will overlap some sort of brickwork or a little sort of raised bits of concrete. And no matter how well the cladding has been installed initially, over time with the temperature changes, there will be a level of warping in that material, creating gaps and holes that those external rodent populations can then exploit to get into the site. So spending a bit of time walking around and feeling your way around the cladding and visually inspecting the cladding for any gaps and holes, again, is invaluable in protecting the site. I've mentioned wall cavities, I always think there'll be a fantastic superpower for anyone to have if you want to be a super pest controller, to have X-ray vision and be able to see into a wall cavity and say, there's a nest in there. Happy days. We're all high-fiving each other by 9:05, having a brew because we found the infestation, everything's dandy. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So any opportunity we get to look into the wall cavities, look into ceilings, subfloor voids, should be used by us. And setting up some sort of monitoring into those areas, even if there's no activity there now, it's a potentially very risky part of the site for rodents to be active within. Whether you end up going down the old school route with your, non-toxic blocks, snap traps, tracking dusts, or the sort of connected traps or monitoring stations that will give you a notification whether something runs through them or gets caught, that's completely up to you. But having that data is very important. Yes, loading bays and shutters. So we can see a row of pretty standard sort of loading bays that you find across many warehouses and these sort of what we call these complex sites. So as we know, it's a high risk of pest ingress. They're very notoriously difficult to prove, although the arsenal of materials that we have available to us is increasing within that specific arena, which is fantastic to see. So there is a variety of different materials you can use specifically designed for the roller shutter doors, for the dock levelers, but the simplest thing that you can recommend to your customer is just keeping the door shut as much as you can. Don't invite the trouble. We're focusing on rodents in this type of open shutters, insect ingress, potential birds flying in. That should be well established on site already. And what you'll see in a lot of those sites is what we call these double-decker bays, which is a particular bane in life of any pest controller dealing with these sorts of sites. So you see those big, massive, tall lorries on the motorways. They have 2 tiers of cages to obviously get more stock in a single trip to those distribution centers and then away off to supermarkets or wherever else they may be potentially going. Now, these a lot of the time are retrofitted onto those existing objects. So we know when you retrofit, when you add something to the side of a building, again, it creates potential for any gaps and voids to be created, which again could provide rodents with a lovely living conditions. In my personal experience, and I'm not saying that this is the case in every single one, but this particular dock leveler, there was literally we were up to our knees in old crisps, poppadoms, rice, frozen goods even, within which the rodents were nesting and living a beautiful, happy life, as happy as a rodent can be, pretty much. So having those scheduled inspections, ideally arranged with the site to have a couple of members of their team with you, just to show them the scale of the issue and potentially some of the cleaning and engineering team. Because the engineer will have to lock those dockers off. There's sort of hydraulic ramps that have to be locked off before you can safely enter the space underneath. And some of the members of the cleaning team just to help shift some of the absolute bulk of items that are very commonly found underneath. Now, expansion joints, most modern structures, well, most structures that we'll come across will have those. They allow the free movement of materials, making sure that the buildings don't crack between the seasons and as the temperature changes. The problem we have a lot of the time, they're not always as well maintained as they should be. In certain situations, you'll find that they'll actually connect from the inside to the outside, almost creating those channels for rodents to run into and give them access to the building fabric. So you can see in this example here on the right, this sort of cracked expansion joint there. But even the internal ones, as you're walking around, do make sure to check the expansion joints. They're usually filled with some sort of rubbery material or sealant. As forklift trucks, as the sort of machinery on site drives over them, they do deplete over time, and those gaps can be created. It's something that we can recommend for it to be fixed and rectified by the site. But in the meantime, make sure you put some tracking dust into it. Make sure that you keep an eye on things, and you'll be able to shine your torch into it and you say, look, there's definitely something running through this. And again, give you that valuable data. Again, racking, very common method of storing large volume of product in stock, whatever it may be. So as I said earlier, these rodents will be used to living in that stock. They'll be used to moving across those pieces of racking. The problem we have is that the stock that we particularly deploy on the sort of ground level tier can be very frequently moved by the forklift truck drivers. That the movement of the stocks throughout the site is very, very heavy a lot of the time. So if you try to deploy any control measures or monitoring measures around those areas, you'll find that they get damaged and ripped out, pulled apart, because forklift truck is a chunky piece of machinery. It's not as precise a tool as we'd hope a lot of the time. So this sort of damage to your stock and to your monitoring will be something that you should expect. So again, it's those visual inspections. That's where the corralling, that's where those tracking preparations really come into their own in terms of establishing whether there's something going on with this in this area or not. Now, stacked pallets. So you can see an example of that. So a stacked pallet externally can be an issue for us in terms of creating harbourage and creating those areas where rodents feel comfortable for periods of time, particularly near the wall line of the building. However, on the inside, we could potentially use them to our advantage. So as I talked about the forklift trucks, pulling out the bottom pallet from the ground level tier of the racking, you could potentially have a conversation with the site to make sure that the stock is kept on 2 or 3 pallets. So when the forklift driver comes to take that piece of stock, at least this bottom pallet is left untouched. And again, it creates a bit more of a stable environment and minimizes the chances of that piece of stock being damaged or ripped out during the process of the stock movement. The problem is, forklift truck drivers in their training, it's absolutely beat into them at the beginning that if they see any of those stacked pallets at the bottom of anything, they'll just move them because there has to be cleared floor underneath. So again, putting potentially some warning posters on the edges of the racking to make sure that those pallets are left untouched, so your control measures are left untouched in place. And it's a conversation worth having, and potentially putting together a meeting in the morning at a shift change. So you get the evening and the morning shift together. Just a quick 5-minute talk, explain why that's in place and why that's an issue. Again, could go a long way. And again, I've already talked about the importance of staff training. Having the site staff pest aware is going to give you a lot of help. Identifying those risk factors, understanding that if they see a spillage, they either report it or they're able to clean it up themselves. Because a lot of the time, it's everybody's feeling the pinch, even those massive companies out there. A lot of the time the cleaning staff will be working as on a skeleton crew. So there might not be enough people to get to every single part of that or spot every single bit of spillage. So again, it goes back to the importance to us of highlighting those issues to the site and ensuring that those are rectified. And then, that leads us nicely onto the point of the pest sightings log, ensuring that the pest sightings log is on the site, ensuring that it's in a place that is accessible by all members of staff. And it creates a bit of a two-way street, doesn't it? Because at the beginning of your inspection, you'll review whatever you need to review, have a chat with the site. And first thing you look at is the pest sightings log. Any signs of activity, you sign them off that you've received the information. And then again, that gives you something to work on reactively from that point on. And again, you can make the pest sightings log as complicated or as simple as you'd like, but making sure that it has certain details on it, like the date and time of the sighting, the member of staff that has seen that issue, what sorts of sighting. It was a cluster of droppings, was a live rodent scurrying away, as close and as very specific to the location as they could potentially be, and potentially giving you some extra details running to a certain part of the warehouse, running to a particular corner. Again, gives you a bit more information to work on. So as I said, it's important to ensure that you review those. If you establish those on site, make sure you review those religiously. And just as we're starting to wrap things up, some of you might end up with a large contract for one of those sites, big manufacturing sites or supermarket distribution centers, or even cash and carry distribution centers can be quite complex. And they have different parts. They'll have a processing part. They'll have a storage warehouse for certain types of food. You'll have freezer units, chilled units, ambient temperature units, and it can be very labor intensive. Those sites can take 4 or 5 days to get around to do a proper inspection. But you don't have to do it all in one go. A lot of people are scared of taking these jobs on because, it's a week out of my calendar every month. But you can split them into sort of separate visits and almost separate contracts in a way. So by splitting this particular example into 4 different parts, on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday of every week in the month, you do this 1 week, this part 1 week, this part 1 week, this part 1 week. And this way you're not having to block off your entire calendar. You can still pick up odd jobs here, particularly in the wasp season, right? We need that flexibility and be able to get on those wasp jobs as quickly as we can. But yeah, you're having to block off a day a week rather than a week a month. And that can make life a lot easier. And again, just a little note from myself, you have pretty much an all access VIP pass. The pests are going to go into every single nook and cranny of this site. You should be able to have access to those parts of the site too. So if there's any rusty padlocks that have been left untouched behind the warehouse, and you can see a bit of grass that's been overgrown with vegetation, some old air conditioning units that are just sitting there that have been redundant for a while, make sure you get into those areas and make sure you can dig your heels in with the site. And that becomes, again, a lot more important if you have a good relationship with them. So it's definitely something worth doing. So just be nosy, give things a pull, give things a tug. One of my trainers, again, when I started in pest control, told me, if you've not set off a fire alarm door, you've never been a pest controller. So that's it. Just open the doors, get through things, and hopefully you won't get into too much trouble. And that's it from me. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for doing that. And yes, it certainly took me back to days of doing technician work.
That's it.
I remember having an abattoir I named the Hoop because it's the only,
Right.
yeah, so because I just saw it every single time I was there, every 2 days for a follow-up. So I just
Yeah.
named it. I was there for a while. Surprise.
That's it.
Amazing. So we don't have any questions in now. I mean, you're super detailed, so I'm not surprised. But we'll give it a couple more minutes just in case there are any questions. But I mean, you've got so much support coming out for you.
Thank you so much.
We have questions coming in now. You may
Wonderful.
I'll let you have a cup of tea.
Thank you. Just a little refresh. Go on. I'm ready.
So we have a question now. So if you stack a pallet on 2 or 3 extra pallets, so I'm going to assume empties, how would that prevent the rats from getting to the stock on the pallet when the rats can climb?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. The stacking of the pallet is essentially just to make your life easier rather than prevent any access from the rodents. So as I said, if you just got one pallet that the stock is sitting on, that forklift truck is having to go down low, and it's obviously quite a bulky thing. If you've got any pieces of preparation between the beams of where the stock is being kept, there's potential for that bait to get nudged under another pallet, then another pallet gets moved, it gets crushed and damaged, and you're losing money and you're having to replace that unit. So just by having that stock a couple of pallets up, the forklift is basically leaving that bottom area untouched. So yeah, it's not going to prevent rodents from going in or out, but it does make your life easier in the long run. But it's again, it's a conversation to have on the site. Some sites have perfectly happy to do that. Some will be a bit iffy and might need a bit more convincing. I'll just say straight no, but it's worth asking.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We've had another question come in.
Yep.
Do you advise businesses to put in risk controls into their risk assessments?
Ooh, so what you I'm not sure what you mean. So in terms of having these sort of like corralling and having to go through the stock and decanting pallets should be accounted in the risk assessments, is that what you mean? If that's the case, then definitely yes. Again, it's, you know, heavy lifting and health and safety aspects definitely feed into that side of things. Those are quite hazardous environments anyway. So yeah, definitely. If there's anything you're looking to establish on that and it's new that you're looking to add to your existing risk assessment, then redo that risk assessment to account for those additional things. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is basically anything that you can do to manage the prevention of pests ultimately.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, amazing. Awesome. I think for the moment, we'll give it a couple more. We've had a few tickle in, just checking chat quickly. No, just lots and lots of support for you. No, awesome. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Awesome. Thank you
really
so much.
appreciate the talk, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.